For 134 years, this image remained buried in the archives of a small Virginia historical society, overlooked and uncatalogued. But when Dr. Malcolm Reed, a historian specializing in African American resistance movements, examined the photograph during a routine research visit, something caught his eye. The father's hand, tucked inside his coat in a gesture reminiscent of Napoleon Bonaparte, George Washington, and other powerful historical figures, wasn't just a pose, it was a signal. A deliberate message encoded in plain sight, pointing to a secret network that operated in the shadows of Jim Crow America, protecting lives and challenging an entire system of oppression. What this one-hand position would reveal about a forgotten hero's true identity would force Dr. Reed to rewrite an entire chapter of American history. If you want to uncover the shocking truth hidden in this 134-year-old photograph, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. You won't believe where this investigation leads. Dr. Malcolm Reed pushed open the heavy wooden door of the Prince Edward County Historical Society on a humid Tuesday morning in June 2024. At 52 years old, he had spent nearly 3 decades researching African American history in post-Reconstruction Virginia, and he knew that the most important stories were often hidden in the smallest, most neglected archives. The Historical Society occupied the second floor of an old brick building in Farmville, Virginia. Its collection consisted mainly of donated materials from local families, land deeds, letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs that had never been properly cataloged or preserved. The Society's volunteer director, an elderly white woman named Mrs. Patterson, greeted him warmly. "Dr. Reed, we're honored to have you. I'm afraid our collection isn't very organized. Most of it is still in boxes." "That's exactly what I'm hoping for," Malcolm said with a smile. "The unorganized collections are where the real discoveries happen." She led him to a storage room lined with metal shelves stacked with cardboard boxes, each labeled with family names and approximate dates. Malcolm had requested access to materials from the 1880s and 1890s, a period when Reconstruction's promises had been violently dismantled, and African Americans faced systematic disenfranchisement and terror. He began methodically working through the boxes, carefully examining documents and photographs. Most were from white families, property records, wedding portraits, business receipts, but occasionally he found materials from black families, usually donated by descendants who had moved north decades earlier. In the 5th box he opened, labeled Miscellaneous Donations, 1920s, 1940s, Malcolm found a small envelope containing 3 photographs. The first 2 showed groups of white men at what appeared to be civic events, but the 3rd photograph made him pause. It showed a black family of 5, a dignified couple flanked by 3 children standing in a modestly furnished parlor. The composition was formal, typical of the era, but something about the father's posture immediately caught Malcolm's trained eye. The man stood with his right hand tucked inside his coat at chest level, his thumb visible outside the fabric. His gaze was direct and proud, his bearing almost regal. The pose was unmistakable. It was the hand in waistcoat gesture, the same stance used by Napoleon, Washington, and countless other leaders throughout history. Malcolm carefully removed the photograph from the envelope and turned it over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Freeman Family, 1890. He set the photograph on the table and stared at it, his historian's instincts tingling. This was something significant. Malcolm photographed the image with his phone and immediately began examining it more closely on his screen, zooming in on different details. The quality was remarkable for a photograph of that era. Sharp focus, good lighting, careful composition. But it was the father's pose that dominated his attention. Malcolm had seen this gesture countless times in his research, always in portraits of powerful men, military leaders, statesmen, aristocrats. It symbolized restrained power, dignified authority, calm leadership. For a black man in 1890, Virginia to adopt this pose was extraordinary. This was barely a generation after slavery's end, during a period when any appearance of black pride or authority could invite deadly violence. The backlash against Reconstruction was in full swing. Jim Crow laws were being enacted across the South. Lynching was used as a tool of racial terror. Yet here was this man, standing in his own home, posing like an emperor. Malcolm's mind raced through possibilities. Was this simply personal pride? A statement of dignity in the face of oppression? Or was it something more? A deliberate signal meant to communicate something specific? He zoomed in further on the photograph, examining every detail. The family's clothing was modest but well maintained. The room showed simple furniture, a side table, a chair, wallpaper with a faint pattern. On the table sat a Bible, prominently displayed. Then Malcolm noticed something he'd initially overlooked, a small embossed stamp in the bottom right corner of the photograph. He enlarged it as much as his phone would allow and could barely make out the words. Archer and Son, photographers, Lynchburg, Va. His pulse quickened. He knew that name. Thomas Archer had been one of the very few black photographers operating in Virginia during the 1880s and 1890s. Malcolm had come across references to Archer's studio in previous research. The man had been known for creating dignified portraits of African Americans during an era when racist imagery dominated popular culture. The choice of photographer was significant. Farmville had closer options, including white-owned studios, but the Freeman family had traveled 50 miles to Lynchburg specifically to have their portrait taken by a black photographer. This wasn't just about getting a family photograph. This was about control, controlling how they were seen, how they were represented, how they would be remembered. Malcolm sat back, his mind connecting dots. The pose, the photographer, the deliberate composition, these weren't accidents. This photograph was trying to tell him something. He just needed to figure out what. Malcolm spent the rest of the day photographing other materials in the archive, but his mind kept returning to the Freeman family portrait. That evening, back in his hotel room in Farmville, he transferred the high-resolution images to his laptop and began a detailed analysis. He opened the photograph and image editing software and systematically examined every section at maximum magnification. The father's face showed a man in his early 40s, with strong features and an unwavering gaze. The mother stood beside him, her expression serious and dignified. The 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 14. Malcolm zoomed in on the father's hand inside his coat. There was definitely something there. A rectangular bulge beneath the fabrics, suggesting he was holding an object. A book? A document? The angle of his fingers indicated he was gripping something deliberately. Then Malcolm noticed something that made him lean closer to the screen. On the man's vest, just visible beside his watch chain, was a small pin. He adjusted the image's contrast and brightness, sharpening the detail as much as possible. The pin was circular, perhaps half an inch in diameter. At its center was a symbol that Malcolm couldn't quite make out, but it appeared to be geometric, possibly a square with something inside or overlaid on it. Malcolm grabbed his notebook and sketched what he could see, then began cross-referencing it with his knowledge of 19th century fraternal organizations. The most obvious possibility was Freemasonry, specifically Prince Hall Freemasonry, which had provided crucial networks of mutual aid and political organizing for African Americans after the Civil War. The Masonic square and compass symbol was well documented. But this pin seemed to have additional elements, something that didn't match the standard Prince Hall regalia Malcolm had seen in other photographs from the period. He pulled up his digital archive of Prince Hall materials and began comparing images. After an hour of searching, he found something that made his breath catch. A reference in a 1912 memoir written by a Prince Hall Mason from Richmond, Virginia. The memoir mentioned, almost in passing, those brothers who once carried the additional mark, the torch and key, in service of work that cannot be named here, but which history will someday honor. The torch and key. Malcolm looked back at the pin in the photograph, squinting at the blurred symbol. Could that be what he was seeing? What work cannot be named? And why did it require a secret symbol within an already secret organization? Malcolm knew he needed expert consultation. The next morning he contacted Dr. Robert Hayes, the official historian of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Virginia, whom he'd worked with on previous research projects. Robert, I need your eyes on something," Malcolm said when Hayes answered the phone. "I found a photograph from 1890 showing a black man wearing what appears to be a modified Masonic pin. There's a torch and key symbol incorporated into it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Where did you find this photograph?" "Prince Edward County Historical Society. The family name is Freeman, from Farmville." "Can you send me the image?" Malcolm immediately emailed the enhanced photographs. 10 minutes later, his phone rang again. "Malcolm, where are you right now?" Hayes's voice carried a tension Malcolm had never heard before. "Still in Farmville. Why?" "Stay there. I'm driving down. I'll be there in 90 minutes. Don't share this photograph with anyone else yet." Hayes arrived at Malcolm's hotel just before noon, carrying a leather briefcase. They sat in Malcolm's room, and Hayes spread several documents across the desk. Old photographs, handwritten ledgers, and photocopies of faded letters. "What you found," Hayes said carefully, "is evidence of something that officially doesn't exist in any Prince Hall records. The lantern bearers." Malcolm leaned forward. "Tell me." Hayes explained that the lantern bearers had been a clandestine group operating within Prince Hall Freemasonry from approximately 1883 to the mid-1890s, primarily in Virginia and North Carolina. They were composed of educated black men, teachers, preachers, small landowners, businessmen, who had organized a covert resistance network during the violent backlash against Reconstruction. They operated an underground railroad, Hayes said, but 20 years after the Civil War ended. They were moving people who were targeted by white supremacist violence, people facing lynching, false charges, designed to trap them in convict leasing, political persecution. The lantern bearers would hide them, forge documents, arrange transportation north. Malcolm felt his historian's instincts ignite. And the pin? The torch and key. The torch for illumination, for bringing light to darkness. The key for opening doors, creating escape routes. Only confirmed members wore it. And only in carefully controlled circumstances like this photograph, taken by a trusted black photographer who was likely part of the network himself, Hayes pointed to the Freeman family portrait. If this man was wearing that pin in 1890, he wasn't just a member. He was active. He was operational. His home was probably a station. Malcolm and Dr. Hayes spent the afternoon at the Prince Edward County Courthouse, searching through property and legal records. Malcolm knew that land ownership was crucial for understanding the lives of African Americans in post-Reconstruction Virginia. It represented autonomy, economic power, and social status in a society designed to keep black people landless and dependent. They found the first reference in a deed book from 1887. Isaiah Freedman of Farmville, had purchased 40 acres of land on the outskirts of town for $380, a substantial sum for the time. 40 acres. The promise that had been made to 4 million formerly enslaved people and then systematically betrayed. Somehow, Isaiah Freeman had managed to acquire that symbolic amount of land through his own means. Malcolm traced Isaiah's name through subsequent records. He appeared in tax rolls, church registries, and census records. The 1880 census listed him as literate, able to read and write, which set him apart from the majority of formerly enslaved people who had been legally prohibited from learning during slavery. In the records of the First Baptist Church of Farmville, Isaiah was listed as a deacon and Sunday school teacher. A notation from 1889 indicated he had donated books to the church library, suggesting not only literacy, but access to education materials. Then Malcolm found Isaiah's death record, November 3rd, 1891. Cause of death: injuries sustained in fall. He was 44 years old. The vague cause of death immediately raised Malcolm's suspicions. In his years of research, he'd learned that accidents, falls, and sudden illnesses in records of black leaders from this period often masked violence. White authorities rarely investigated or accurately recorded deaths when the victims were black and the perpetrators were white. Malcolm cross-referenced the date with newspaper archives. In the November 7th, 1891 edition of the Richmond Planet, a black-owned newspaper, he found a brief obituary. Isaiah Freeman, respected landowner and educator of Farmville, departed this life on November 3rd following a tragic accident. He leaves behind his wife Ruth, 3 children, and a community that benefited immeasurably from his quiet service and boundless courage. Services were held at First Baptist Church, with more than 200 in attendance despite inclement weather and difficulties. The phrase, quiet service and boundless courage, stood out to Malcolm. The wording felt deliberately coded, and the detail about difficulties attending the funeral suggested possible intimidation or threats. Malcolm looked at Dr. Hayes. He didn't die in an accident, did he? Hayes shook his head slowly. Probably not. Late 1891 was when several lantern bearers were discovered and killed. The network had been infiltrated or exposed somehow. Isaiah Freeman likely died protecting someone. Malcolm knew he needed to see Isaiah Freeman's actual property. Using the coordinates from the 1887 land deed, he and Dr. Hayes drove to the location the following morning. The original 40 acres had long since been subdivided and developed, but the original Freeman house still stood remarkably intact. It had been converted into a duplex rental property, with the owner living on one side. Malcolm knocked on the door and introduced himself to the owner, Carolyn Patterson, a retired teacher in her mid-60s. When he explained his research on Isaiah Freeman and showed her the 1890 photograph, her eyes widened. "I've lived here for 15 years, Carolyn said, "and I always knew this house had history, but I never knew whose. Please, come in." The interior had been modified over the decades, but the basic structure remained. Malcolm walked through the rooms, comparing the layout to the photograph. The parlor where the Freeman family had posed for their portrait was now Carolyn's living room, though the walls had been relocated. Malcolm examined the architecture carefully, looking for irregularities, spaces that didn't quite make sense, walls that seemed thicker than necessary, doors that were slightly misaligned. In what had been the original parlor, he noticed that the baseboards didn't match. 3 walls had standard white-painted pine baseboards, but the 4th wall, behind a built-in bookshelf, had darker, thicker baseboards that appeared to be from a different period. "Mrs. Patterson, may I move this bookshelf?" With her permission, Malcolm and Dr. Hayes shifted the heavy furniture away from the wall. Behind it, the baseboard was indeed different, older, made of walnut instead of pine. Malcolm knelt down and examined it closely. There was a seam, almost invisible, running along the edge. He pressed gently on the wood and heard a soft click. A section of the wall, about 3 feet wide, swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind the false wall was a concealed space. Not quite a room, but a crawl space, about 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and just tall enough for an adult to sit upright. The walls were bare, the floor covered in decades of dust. Carolyn gasped. "I had no idea this was here." Malcolm shone his phone's flashlight into the space and saw words carved into the wooden support beam at the back. "God sees, IF 1890. This was it. This was where Isaiah Freeman had hidden people fleeing for their lives. This cramped, airless space had been a sanctuary, a station on a secret railroad operating in the heart of Jim Crow, Virginia. Malcolm asked Carolyn for permission to document and search the hidden space. She agreed immediately, as fascinated as he was by the discovery. He carefully entered the cramped area, moving slowly to avoid disturbing anything that might have historical value. Dr. Hayes photographed every angle, while Malcolm examined the space inch by inch. The walls showed no markings beyond the carved inscription. The floor was bare wood, covered in thick dust that suggested no one had been inside for decades. But as Malcolm ran his hands along the floorboards, he felt one plank shift slightly under pressure. He carefully pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived more than 130 years, was a small bundle. Malcolm's hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out and returned to the main room. With Carolyn and Dr. Hayes watching intently, he unwrapped the oilcloth on the living room table. Inside were 3 items: a folded letter, a small leather-bound notebook, and a brass button bearing the torch and key symbol of the lantern bearers. The notebook was filled with Isaiah Freeman's careful handwriting, coded entries that listed only dates, initials, and single-word destinations. June 12, 1888, J.W., Richmond. September 3, 1889, M.T., Lynchburg. February 14, 1890, S.P. and Child, Philadelphia. Malcolm counted carefully. Between 1888 and 1891, there were 37 entries. 37 people had passed through this house, through that hidden room behind the wall, on their journey to safety. The final entry was dated October 28, 1891, just 6 days before Isaiah's death. It read simply, R.L., departed north, pursued closely. Dr. Hayes's voice was quiet. He died protecting this last person. R.L. made it out, but they came for Isaiah. Malcolm carefully unfolded the letter. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but still legible. It was addressed to the family of Isaiah Freeman and dated December 1891. The handwriting was less practiced than Isaiah's, the spelling imperfect, but the emotion was unmistakable. I'm writing from Philadelphia, where I am safe. My name is Robert Lewis, and Mr. Isaiah Freeman saved my life this past October when I was being hunted for a crime I did not do. He hid me in his house when they came searching. He stood between me and them. He told them he had seen nobody. They did not believe him, but had no proof. He gave me food and money and a train ticket north. He told me run fast and live free. I did. I'm working now and have sent for my wife and son. Someone should know what he'd done. He was a hero. Malcolm returned to his university in Washington, D.C., with photographs and scans of everything he'd discovered. The Freeman case had opened a door to something much larger, and he was determined to map the entire network. Working with Dr. Hayes and a team of graduate research assistants, Malcolm began cross-referencing the initials and dates in Isaiah Freeman's notebook with historical records from across Virginia and beyond. Newspaper reports of missing persons, church records, census data, property transfers. The work was painstaking. Many of the people Isaiah had helped had disappeared intentionally, creating new identities in northern cities where they hoped to escape the violence and persecution that had threatened their lives in the South. But occasionally, Malcolm found traces. M.T., from September 1889, appeared to be Moses Turner, who had been accused of insolence toward a white shopkeeper in Farmville, an accusation that often preceded lynching. Turner's name disappeared from Virginia records after that date, but appeared in church rolls in Lynchburg in 1890 and then in Philadelphia by 1892. S.P. and Child, from February 1890, matched Sarah Porter, a young widow whose husband had been killed by a white mob after a labor dispute. Porter had reportedly fled north with her infant daughter. Malcolm found her name in the 1900 census in New York City, listed as a seamstress living with her teenage daughter. Each identification felt like resurrection, bringing forgotten lives back into the historical record, documenting survival and resistance. But Malcolm also began finding references to other lantern bearers. Isaiah Freeman hadn't worked alone. The notebook included occasional annotations, coordinated with T.A. in Lynchburg, almost certainly Thomas Archer, the photographer. Transferred to J.M. in Richmond. Possibly James Mitchell, a Prince Hall mason and undertaker whose business would have provided perfect cover for moving people. Malcolm discovered that the network had extended throughout Virginia and into North Carolina, with stations approximately 50 miles apart, a day's travel by horse or train. Each station was operated by a trusted member, usually someone with legitimate reasons for travel, property that offered hiding places, and community standing that made them less immediately suspicious. The lantern bearers had created an infrastructure of freedom operating in plain sight, hidden behind the facades of churches, businesses, and family homes. They had moved people, forged documents, pooled money for tickets, and provided false employment references, all while living under constant threat of discovery and death. And Isaiah Freeman, with his hand tucked inside his coat like Napoleon, had been one of the network's most crucial operators. 6 months into his research, Malcolm sat in his university office, the original Freeman family photograph displayed on his computer screen, alongside dozens of other images and documents he'd collected. He finally understood the full meaning of that pose, the hand inside the coat. It wasn't mere imitation of powerful white men, though it certainly referenced that iconography. It was a multi-layered message, carefully encoded for different audiences. To hostile white observers, it might appear as harmless vanity, a black man pretending to grandeur, imitating his betters in a way that could be dismissed or mocked but not prosecuted. The racism of the era worked in Isaiah's favor. White supremacists underestimated him precisely because they couldn't imagine a black man wielding real power. But to those who understood the symbolism, fellow lantern bearers, people seeking help, members of the network, the pose was a signal. It identified Isaiah as someone connected to power and protection, someone who could be trusted, someone who held resources and authority. And most intimately, the pose literally represented what Isaiah did. He kept crucial items hidden inside his coat, close to his heart. The lantern bearer pin, documents for people fleeing persecution, money for train tickets, the notebook that recorded his dangerous work. The photograph itself had been created as a form of documentation and communication. Thomas Archer, the photographer, was part of the network. The image was likely copied and circulated among trusted allies, serving as a way to identify safe houses and reliable operatives. Malcolm also realized that the photograph was taken in 1890, 1 year before Isaiah's death and during the period when the lantern bearers were most active and most at risk. It was possible that Isaiah knew the danger was increasing, that the network was being infiltrated or exposed. The photograph might have been a deliberate act of documentation, creating a record of who he was and what he stood for in case he didn't survive. The fact that Isaiah posed with his entire family suggested something else. He wanted them included in his legacy. He was showing them, and showing future generations, that resistance and courage were family values, not individual acts. His children stood in that photograph as witnesses to their father's principles. Ruth Freeman, Isaiah's wife, stood beside her husband with equal dignity. Malcolm wondered how much she knew, how much she participated. In his experience, networks like the Lantern Bearers required family cooperation. Ruth must have known about the hidden room, must have helped feed and care for the people sheltering there, must have shared the risk. Malcolm Reed's research on Isaiah Freeman and the Lantern Bearers was published in the Journal of African American History in early 2025. The article titled Hidden Networks, the Lantern Bearers, and Post-Reconstruction Resistance in Virginia caused immediate scholarly attention. But Malcolm wanted the story to reach beyond academic circles. He worked with the Prince Edward County Historical Society to create an exhibition featuring the Freeman family photograph, the hidden room artifacts, and documentation of the broader Lantern Bearer network. The exhibition opened in June 2025, exactly 1 year after Malcolm had first discovered the photograph. Carolyn Patterson generously allowed the hidden room in her home to be documented and occasionally opened for small tour groups, with proper historical context. Malcolm also worked with genealogists who specialized in African American family history, trying to locate descendants of the people Isaiah Freeman had helped. Through Robert Lewis's letter, they traced his family line to Philadelphia and eventually connected with his great-great-granddaughter, Patricia Lewis, a retired nurse living in the city. When Malcolm called to tell her what he'd discovered about her ancestor, Patricia wept. "We always knew he'd come from Virginia," she said. "We knew he'd escaped something. But we never knew the details, never knew who helped him. My family owes our existence to Isaiah Freeman." Patricia traveled to Farmville for the exhibition opening. Malcolm also located several Freeman descendants, including Teresa Williams, a high school history teacher in Baltimore who had never known the full story of her great-great-grandfather's courage. At the exhibition opening, Malcolm stood before the enlarged Freeman family photograph and addressed the crowd of scholars, community members, and descendants. He explained the hand and waistcoat pose, the hidden symbolism, the secret network, the 37 lives saved. "This photograph," Malcolm said, "is a testimony to a kind of heroism that history often overlooks. Isaiah Freeman wasn't a famous leader. He didn't command armies or write constitutions, but he used what power he had, his literacy, his land, his connections, to protect people who had nowhere else to turn. And he did it knowing it could cost him everything, which it ultimately did." He paused, looking at the image of Isaiah Freeman hand tucked inside his coat, gaze steady and proud. For 134 years, this photograph kept it secret, but now we know the truth. That hand hidden inside his coat wasn't just a pose. It was holding freedom itself. And Isaiah Freeman gave that freedom away, again and again, until he had nothing left to give but his life. That's the legacy he left us. That's what this photograph really shows. Ordinary courage that changed the world, one life at a time.